Welcome back to the Bible Study Podcast. In today's episode, we cover Bible Study TTPs, terms, tactics, and procedures. Hopefully we alleviate some confusion, maybe create some as well. All this and no more in today's episode. Swirling around the idea of Bible study are a handful of terms like Japanese hornets that terrify people and keep them from going into the woods. These terms can create an unsettling feeling like you're not doing something right, and they can keep you away from any real serious Bible study. We're going to talk about some of these terms today. Terms like hermeneutics, methods, procedures. Now, some people might be tempted to say something like, why does that matter? I don't need no strategy to study the Bible. Well, maybe. You don't need a strategy to remove an appendix, but it helps if you want to regularly pull them out. And the Bible's the same way. If you wanted to regularly pull out the meaning, you want a strategy. We want a strategy, and we want a tactical approach to studying the Bible. And the thing with the systemized tactical approach to anything is you can make small changes and see what differences those changes make. Now, if you don't have a strategy, you can make changes, but it means nothing. There's no way to gather or register the effect of those changes. So throughout this series, we're going to build a strategy. We're going to build a tactical approach to studying the Bible. And in order to do that, we have to understand some terms. The first term we're going to cover is hermeneutics. Now, hermeneutics it's a branch of knowledge that deals with interpretation, mainly with interpreting texts. And what is relevant for us in this series, obviously, would be the interpretation of the Bible, right? So hermeneutical principles for the Bible. Now, there are hermeneutical principles for all sorts of stuff, right? The guiding principles exist for interpreting Paradise Lost or Gallic Wars. But what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about the principles that guide us in studying the Bible. So a principle is just think of it as a foundational truth or proposition that serves as a base for a system of belief or behavior. Now let me give you a few examples. Here's a life principle. C.S. Lewis, it's a C.S. Lewis quote, "You have never met a mere mortal. They are either an immortal splendor or an immortal horror." And if you believe that to be true, that can be a guiding principle that undergirds the way you deal with people. Here's a personal finance principle. If you get a mortgage, get a 15-year fixed rate where the monthly payments do not exceed your monthly take-home. I'm not saying whether it's a good principle or not, but with that principle, it could guide you in your process of buying a home. Some generic Bible study principles that you might have heard before: never read a Bible verse. Context is king. Beware the tyranny of the present. With those principles alone, you could build methods to studying the Bible. But we are actually going to get a little bit more technical with our Bible hermeneutics. So our Bible hermeneutics are a set of core principles that provide a foundation for us to discover the meaning of the text and to try to determine its significance for our lives today. And that's what we mean when we talk about biblical hermeneutics, meaning and its significance for us today. And there are a handful of foundational hermeneutical principles that we're going to cover throughout this entire series. But before we get to the ones that we're going to talk about, I at least wanted to mention that there are other branches or categories of biblical principles, hermeneutical principles: literary criticism, post-structuralism, social scientific, allegorical. Those are all completely separate, say, categories of principles. So within each one of those, you might have guiding truths that would dictate how you approach the text. You could hold to a hermeneutical principle that says there are levels of meaning to any given passage. The hermeneutical principle that we are going to be talking about is the historical grammatical principle, sometimes referred to as the literal or the literary principle to biblical hermeneutics. The next term after biblical hermeneutics would be study methods. Now, study methods are the tactical approach to understanding something specific about the Bible. Now, these methods, they're distinct from the principles. Okay, their methods and principles, hermeneutical principles anyways, are not the same thing. But these methods are guided by the principles. So think of it like a procedure used to accomplish something. If you wanted to investigate the natural world, what method would you use? How about the scientific method? Right? And in the scientific method, there is a process, there is a systematized process to accomplish that. So guided by the biblical hermeneutical principle, we can use methods like the word study method to understand how a word is used in the Bible, or the topical method to understand topics in the Bible, or a verse-by-verse method to understand how the verses interlock, right? What is the connective tissue there? Thematic method, understand themes, and there's more. But each one of these methods has a process or a procedure that we want to follow to complete the method. So take the scientific method again as an example. The scientific method has within itself a process. What do? You ask a question, you do some background research, you construct a hypothesis, you test with an experiment, and you find out if it's working. Is the procedure working? If it is, you can analyze some data, draw some conclusions, communicate the results, publish them, get some peer review studies done, and do whatever else the scientific method might demand of you. If you wanted to build a house, you might want to adhere to certain principles of, say, aesthetics, efficiency, environmental impact, and you might use the Vogon poetry method for aesthetics, and that the process would include building overly simple, drawn-out, and boring contours. If you wanted to build a pool, you can have all the methods in the world, but they won't work if you violate the principles of gravity and hydraulic pressure. So in biblical terms, it might go like this. The guiding hermeneutical principle would be the historical grammatical principle. You might use the thematic method underpinned by the historical grammatical principle to try and understand the themes in, say, the book of Genesis. The thematic method would have a series of steps like underline keywords and phrases. And you would take these steps and it would take you from ignorance to understanding of the text, understanding to a certain degree. I'm in no way saying this is foolproof or this will always result in the most perfect answer. Obviously, it doesn't. 2,000 years of church history, bickering and fighting shows that is not the case. A standard 3-step procedure for textual analysis would be observe, interpret, and apply, or respond, right? Because we are talking about response. And without having any polls or numbers in front of me, my guess would be that Christians tend to skip observe and interpret and go straight to apply. So they might read it once and they immediately try to apply it to their life without understanding anything. They have no idea what the meaning is, and it makes no sense. It's seriously odd, it's weird, and sometimes it borderline superstitious, right? Their response to the text is superstitious. So think like the cause of your sickness is some unconfessed sin in your life, or if you raise children in accordance with Christian beliefs, they will become Christians. I would call those Christian superstitions. The final term I would like to cover would be a framework, or at least in our case, an interpretive framework. A framework is a guiding structure that everything else fits neatly into. It is often confused with a hermeneutical principle, at least in practice, but frameworks and principles are not the same. So think dispensationalism or covenantalism. You see biblical history and future events as only existing in this framework, and you are tempted to make sure everything fits into that framework, or at least find some way to make it fit. So if there's an outlier, if you hold to a framework and you find an outlier verse, you're go around and around trying to find ways to make that verse fit into the framework. It doesn't mean that frameworks have no value. They do provide a loose guide for viewing confusing texts or events. But if you are not careful and you're not regularly challenging your own views, they can put you in an awkward position of caring more about the framework than the text you may actually be studying. That's all for now. If you have any questions, email us at newsif@yahoo.com. That's newsif@yahoo.com. Until next time, peace out, pray, and read your Bible.